Okay, Charbs, let me start with two political cartoons today. First is an image of a British soldier floating on top of the remains of a ship. It was first published in the Daily Mirror on March 6th, 1942. The caption read, "The price of petrol has been increased by 1 penny. Official." This cartoon caused quite a bit of controversy in the period after its publication. It pissed off Winston Churchill. The Minister of Supply in England, Herbert Morrison, said that the cartoon was worthy of Goebbels at his best, a reference to Hitler's propaganda minister. The future of the Daily Mirror had to be debated in Parliament, as Churchill ordered MI5 to do a background investigation on the cartoonist. It was a big deal. So what's actually even happening in this cartoon? Well, a merchant marine is gripping onto part of a ship that we can presume was torpedoed by the Germans. The caption references the price increase in petrol. Churchill and many others interpreted this cartoon in a way that would lower the morale of the British soldiers. They saw the cartoon as arguing that the British government was putting British lives at risk in order to increase the price of petrol and put money into the pockets of oil barons. That's just how they saw it. Oof, my Long Island accent just came out there. The artist, however, claimed the cartoon argued for people to use less petrol in their daily lives because the British Navy needed it. In fact, the original caption for this cartoon was, "Petrol is dearer now." The cartoonist, Philip Zek, claims that he received plenty of emails from his readers saying that they understood the argument correctly and would be keeping their cars in the garage to save petrol. That misunderstanding almost had radical consequences for the concept of a free press. The future of a publication was debated in Parliament. I find a few things interesting about this. First is the obvious issue between the intention of the artist and the meaning that the audience projected onto it. But in addition to that, it's interesting just how much rage this inspired. It pissed people off. A simple pen and ink drawing. Sure, articles and publications like the Daily Mirror piss people off too, but not quite like this. The ability of an image to provoke that kind of response is fascinating. Which brings us to another cartoon that caused plenty of rage. This is the cover of the July 2008 edition of The New Yorker. Obama had to take time out of his campaign to address it and express his displeasure with it. People canceled their New Yorker subscriptions. It was a big deal. The image obviously shows the Obamas as terrorists giving each other a fist bump. For context, and for those of you that don't remember, the Obamas had recently fist bumped each other publicly, and it caused an absurd reaction. On America's Pulse, a Fox News show, E.D. Hill actually asked whether or not the fist bump was a terrorist fist bump. No joke, that happened. Look at the headlines. So the cartoonist here, Barry Blitt, claims that his cartoon was not a caricature of the Obamas, but a caricature of the reaction to the fist bump. He wanted to make fun of E.D. Hill. The editor, David Remnick, tried to explain the cartoon, which you know is never a good sign, by arguing that it's not a satire about Obama, it's a satire about the distortions and prejudices about Obama. I think Barry Blitt and many others learned an important lesson about the limits of the caricature art form that day. E.D. Hill attempted to caricature the Obamas, and Blitt tried to caricature that caricature. Through this episode, we learned that an artist just can't do that. Blitt's cartoon was indistinguishable from a cartoon that would have been drawn by the Fox News host if that host had Blitt's artistic skill. So, every day's a school day. We all learn something. You cannot caricature a caricature. We also, again, have that old issue between authorial intent and the meaning created by the audience. That discrepancy appears often enough in art theory, but what makes this example interesting is the rage involved. Cartoons and caricatures have a way of inspiring rage that other forms of art or journalism just don't. Jarrell Krauss, a former New York Times op-ed art director, said it well when she argued that nearly any notion is palatable when rendered in prose. When the same notion is pictured, however, the record shows that op-ed editors see it as a far greater threat. So what's up with that? How can cartoons like this cause such a reaction when the articles inside the publications rarely, if ever, have anything that causes such extreme emotions? Let's quickly move through 3 arguments proposed by Victor Navasky in his book, The Art of Controversy, on this topic. The content theory states that every political cartoon has an argument, and the content of that argument can sometimes piss people off. Cartoons take a position on a controversial topic, and in order to make that argument clear, it needs to be extreme, simplified, and concise. And even though the arguments are simplified, they're nearly impossible to argue against. Like, in an article, I can cite a line and say, here's why what that author is saying is wrong. But it's much harder to cite a caricature representation of somebody, like this one, for example, and say, here's why Kissinger isn't screwing the world. You would end up sounding pathetic if you tried to argue with that cartoon. So the content of the cartoon will piss off fans of Kissinger without giving them a way to argue back. And I could see why that would be infuriating. Then there is image theory, which states that the power of the cartoon to inspire extreme emotional responses is because the cartoon is a cartoon. The content theory stresses the importance of the argument embedded inside the cartoon, but the image theory stresses the power of the image itself. Images are powerful. This belief in the power of visual representation is ancient. The earliest forms of religion invested enormous power in images painted on the walls of caves. The historian of religion, Karen Armstrong, who I love to quote, tells us that if an ancient priest dressed in the regalia of the divine animal master, the priest would then become the embodiment of the animal master. The image has a relationship to the authentic thing being represented. We attribute lots of power to our sense of sight. If the priest looks like the divine, the priest is the divine. This supremacy of our sense of sight appears throughout our language. I see what you mean. Seeing is believing. Pics or it didn't happen. Images have a totemic or talismanic power. They always have. That's why so many religions either actively invest loads of resources in the production of images, or they fear the persuasive power of the image so much that they outright ban the production of images. So maybe cartoons are so effective at inspiring dramatic reactions because we are hardwired to attribute to images power to capture the essence of the person or thing that they represent. The art historian David Friedberg argued that if paintings and sculptures are simply pieces of wood and stone, inert and insignificant, why destroy them? Images are feared not because they are dead, but because they seem to be, and often are believed to be, alive. And that seems to sum it up for me. Images have power because they are images. The Neuro-aesthetics theory for why cartoons produce extreme reaction states that the cartoons gain their power because of the ways that our brains work and respond to them. Take the peak shift effect, for example. Young herring gull chicks, when they see their mother herring gull, they think that they're going to be fed. And when researchers reconstruct the image of their mother's beak by placing a red dot on a piece of wood, the chicks peck like crazy. The stimulus shifts, but the action remains the same and is even exaggerated through the inanimate representation. An exaggerated stimulus leads to an exaggerated response. Caricatures do the same thing. They take a stimulus, let's say Richard Nixon, and distill him into a widow's peak and jowls. So the response to this cartoon of Richard Nixon could be an exaggerated response that the real Nixon might engender. The stimulus shifts and the reaction is intensified. Obviously, these three theories are not mutually exclusive, and they're all true to some degree. Cartoons can inspire anger more quickly and more sharply than well-crafted sentences. By their nature, they essentialize their subject, and nobody likes to be essentialized. You can check out that ContraPoints video on cancel culture if you want a further explanation of that. Images are powerful, they're dangerous, and they can hurt. But they can also heal, and they can also build communities. The same artist who drew the Price of Petrol cartoon, Philip Zek, also drew this one, hoping to evoke an urgent response and sense of responsibility to the sacrifice made by the soldiers of World War II. It provokes a sense of obligation and empowerment rather than anger. Like, people like me like to go on about Lincoln's concise and perfectly crafted 2.5-minute speech at Gettysburg, but this cartoon essentially carries the same message and doesn't even need the 2 minutes. It's so fast, it's so powerful. Which brings our attention to another thing that cartoons can do. Because their message hits immediately, and because they evoke an emotional response right away, They are a sort of way to test out a lot of arguments to see how effective they are in an efficient way. Like during World War II, some cartoonists tried to picture Hitler as dangerous and powerful. Lots of cartoonists attempted a lot of different strategies to frustrate Hitler and inspire opposition. Some cartoonists, like David Lowe, pictured him as childish and prone to tantrums. The arguments that illustrated him as scary perhaps inspired action on the part of Europe, but the ones that pictured him as silly inspired him to respond. He felt like he needed to respond by publishing a book, which his foreign press secretary called Hitler in the World's Cartoons, Fact versus Ink, wherein he tried to argue against those images of him. And doesn't that just make him seem pathetic? Obviously, we can't measure the impact of something like this on his power base, but the larger point I'm trying to make here is that because cartoons make these types of arguments more concise, they allow a community to test out the emotional impact of many arguments quickly to see how to gain support or provoke a reaction that they want. This is particularly true in the 21st century on social media, where the sharing of images can happen so quickly and in such volume. Images, specifically memes, serve as a way for movements or campaigns to try a bunch of arguments quickly to see which ones inspire the desired or emotional response by getting likes and shares. We see it all the time during political campaigns or campaigns for large-scale changes in behavior to combat global climate change or slow the spread of COVID-19. We use images because they inspire emotional responses quickly, and then those emotional responses can be leveraged to change behavior or belief. But I don't know. Let me know if you have any stories of emotional responses to images or political cartoons in the comments below. Thank you for watching.